Chapter 1. Elizabeth Miller read through the requirements of yet another man seeking a bride. Her desk was littered with letters from men from all over the country. She was intrigued as she read it, thinking that maybe soon she'd take the plunge and become a mail-order bride herself. Anything was better than spending the rest of her life in the midst of unrequited love. "Miss Miller? Do you need anything this afternoon?" Bernard Tandy asked from the doorway of her office. Elizabeth shook her head. "No, thank you," she responded, her heart fluttering as it did every time she saw him. Bernard had worked for her for almost 10 years now, and every day her feelings for him became stronger and more intense. She wasn't certain how much longer she could hide them. As he turned away, she called out to him. "Wait." He turned back and gazed at her, his face formal. She didn't remember ever hearing him laugh. He worked so hard at maintaining their formal relationship. He was her butler and bodyguard. Nothing more. "Yes? Would you sit down for a moment? I want to show you something." Bernard walked into the room and sat down on the sofa across from her. He took the letter she offered him and read it, his face intense as it always was when he was reading a missive from a potential groom. "Do you want me to investigate this Robert Weist, Miss Miller?" "Eventually, of course, but first I want to know if you think he would be suitable for me." She watched his face carefully for any sign that he didn't want her marrying another man. Surely he had some emotions under his formal exterior. Bernard's eyes widened, showing his surprise at her words. "For you? What do you mean?" "Exactly what you think I mean. I think it's time I marry and have children. I never meant to be a businesswoman for the rest of my life." Elizabeth shrugged, watching Bernard closely. "Mr. Weist lives in Fort Worth, Texas. I'd be close to Susan." Bernard knew immediately she was talking about her older sister who had gone to Texas as a mail-order bride more than 10 years before. That's not enough reason to marry a stranger. "Miss Miller, Elizabeth, I don't want to see you married to someone simply because you're looking for a potential husband. Let me investigate him. He'd find something derogatory in the man's background." "He had to." Elizabeth nodded. "Do you think you'll go to Fort Worth to do it?" She knew he could call on their contacts in that part of the country, but felt strongly he'd want to investigate himself. At his nod, Elizabeth smiled softly. "How would you feel if I went with you and visited Susan and her family? I'd like to get to know my nieces and nephews." Susan had married a rancher just outside Fort Worth, who had 4 young sons. She had 2 daughters now that Elizabeth had yet to meet, and a newborn son. Well, he was a few months old, but that was close enough to newborn for Elizabeth. Despite the fact that she sent women to marry men all over the country, she'd never stepped foot outside Massachusetts. While travel sounded nice, she longed for a family of her own. Maybe spending the extra time with Bernard would make her realize he wasn't as perfect as she wanted him to be. Maybe it was time for her to see a new place. Bernard frowned. She'd never asked to go with him on a business trip before, and while he wasn't opposed to the idea, he wasn't for it either. How could he spend that much time in her company? "I'm not certain that's a good idea, Miss Miller." Using her formal name helped him to rebuild the wall between them in his mind. "You called me Elizabeth just a minute ago. Why is it back to Miss Miller?" "I'm going to Fort Worth to see my sister, and I can go alone, or you can go with me." She knew he would insist she couldn't go alone as an unmarried woman. She looked forward to the extra time spent with him. How could she not? Maybe, just maybe, if she was under his thumb for the long journey, he would realize she was the woman that would complete him. Bernard sighed. "You can't go alone. You never know what kind of scoundrel will prey on a young lady traveling alone." He shook his head. How could she even consider going alone after the fiasco with the Deacons? She shrugged. "We send mail-order brides out west alone all the time. I really don't see what the difference is. The difference is that the mail order brides are not under my care, and you are. When do you want to leave? He knew it was a mistake to travel with her. How could he hide his feelings if they were constantly around each other? At least in Beckham, he could go home to his small house every evening, and he had a real job directing the servants. On a train, he'd have nothing to do but spend time with her. She mentally calculated how long it would take to pack. Her younger sister, Mary, sometimes helped her with the business, so she could easily take her place for the time she was gone. I'd like to leave in 2 weeks. She turned back to her desk, pulling a sheet of paper to her. I trust that will work for you, she asked, looking at him over her shoulder. Bernard nodded once. He didn't really have a choice. Yes, miss. I'll investigate him while we're there. How long do you expect you'll want to stay? Elizabeth shrugged. A week or 2, probably. He got to his feet. I'll be ready. I'll start my preliminary investigation of Mr. Weist in the meantime. He paused just before he reached the door. Don't be too hasty, Miss Miller. I don't want to see you make a mistake. I'll be careful. Elizabeth quickly penned a note to her sister, Susan. Soon, she would be in Fort Worth. She couldn't wait to play doting auntie. Seeing Susan would be nice as well, she supposed, but really? She couldn't wait to get her hands on her sister's newest baby. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Elizabeth was surprised Bernard hadn't tried to talk her out of going to Fort Worth. She packed her bag carefully, taking only the necessities as she thought about the man. She knew him, but she didn't. He'd been hired by Harriet Long, the former owner of the mail-order bride agency she now ran. Harriet had moved to Seattle as a mail-order bride herself, and she'd carefully groomed Elizabeth to take her place. Elizabeth went into her office one last time before leaving, checking on her younger sister, Mary. Mary was married with a daughter of her own, but she was always happy to help out when Elizabeth needed her. It was amazing how well most of the demon horde had grown up, despite their lack of discipline when they were younger. Are you sure you can handle things while I'm gone? Elizabeth asked as she took little Agatha from her mother, bouncing her in her arms. She loved being an aunt. If she couldn't be a mother, she could at least shower her siblings' babies with love. Mary nodded. I've worked with you enough over the years that I'm sure I'll be fine. It'll be nice to take a break from being a farm wife for a while and step into your shoes. Elizabeth frowned. Her life was a lot less dangerous now that the Deacons had been caught, but that didn't mean it was perfectly safe in Beckham now either. Just remember to use the telephone to reach the police if you need to. I don't want anything to happen to you or Agatha. Mary laughed. Nothing is going to happen to us. I promise. She picked up a letter from Elizabeth's desk and handed it to her sister. Just as she started to read the letter again, she heard a throat being cleared from the doorway of her office. It's time for us to leave, Miss Miller. Elizabeth got to her feet. My carpet bag is on my bed, Bernard. Would you mind getting it for me? She walked to her sister, bending down to hug her quickly and placing a quick kiss on Agatha's chubby cheek. I'll be back in about 3 weeks. Mary smiled, leaning back in her chair. Give my love to Susan. I will. Elizabeth did a mental check to make certain she had everything she needed, and had given her sister all the information she needed to make it possible for her to carry on. Be safe. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Bernard inhaled deeply as he stepped into Elizabeth's bedroom. It smelled like her, the same as it always did. He'd only crossed the threshold into her bedroom a few times, but it carried the scent of her lemon-scented soap. He loved the smell of lemons, because to him, they meant Elizabeth. He picked up her bag from her bed and headed toward the door, pleased she was going with him, even as he worried about her presence on the train. Her activities with helping women escape from men who wanted to force them into slavery had made her unpopular with some. He worried for her safety. There had been no danger since the Deacons had been caught a few months before, but he still worried every day. Surely it couldn't be that simple. The danger would come back, wouldn't it? When it did, he'd be at Elizabeth's side. Stopping back at Elizabeth's office, he smiled at her. She was small, too small to his way of thinking. Why, she was barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, compared to his 6 feet 3 inches. They both had blonde hair, but his eyes were blue and hers were green. He held both of their bags in one hand as he held his arm out to her. Maybe it would look odd to others for a beautiful woman to be walking along on the arm of her butler, but he didn't really care. The pistol in his pocket was there for her safety, and he'd keep her close to him at all times. Elizabeth took his arm, feeling a frisson of energy zing up her arm and into her heart. She had touched Bernard very few times over the years they'd worked together, and it struck her every time just how strong he was, and how handsome. "Have you purchased the train tickets?" she asked softly, trying to keep her voice even. It was hard for her to touch him and speak coherently at the same time. He turned her brain into oatmeal. "Yes, of course I have." Bernard looked at her with surprise as they walked toward the train station. He'd walked the streets of Beckham many times over the years, on his way to other places or doing errands for Elizabeth, but never with her. She knew he saw to every detail. She smiled. "I should have known better than to ask. You always take care of me, Bernard." And he did. She loved him for it too. She only wished she could find the courage to tell him. She resisted the urge to turn to him and plant a kiss on his shoulder. It was getting harder for her to resist those urges every day. They walked along in silence, commenting sometimes on the things they saw. They were comfortable enough with one another after working together for so long, they didn't need to speak. There was no one she felt more comfortable with than Bernard. They reached the station just minutes before their train was called, and they boarded the train together. "I got you a spot on the sleeping car," he told her. Elizabeth looked back over her shoulder. "And one for yourself?" He shook his head slowly. Often, he did get a room on the sleeping car for himself, but he didn't feel like he could be trusted to be that close to his employer. "No, I'll be in the main car." Elizabeth sniffled. "Some bodyguard you are." She didn't need someone to watch over her, but if that was his purpose in going with her on her trip, then he wasn't going about it well. "It wouldn't be proper for me to sleep in your car with you," he explained. "You're a single lady with a reputation to worry about. Why don't you sleep in the car beside mine then? You could still keep an eye on me that way." Bernard shook his head. "It doesn't work that way. The men's sleeping car is separate from the women's sleeping car. The closest I can be to you is in the main car." "So married couples wouldn't be able to travel together?" "No, a married couple could room together. We are not married. I won't ruin your reputation by staying in the same room with you." Bernard didn't look at her during his explanation. He was worried she would see his need to be with her in his eyes. Elizabeth frowned. Would now be a good time to tell him that he was the only man she wanted to marry? Or were the words better left unspoken? "I've never been on a train before. I'm nervous." "You'll do fine. We'll spend most of the day together, and at night you'll retire to your room. I can sleep in my seat." Elizabeth thought about all the brides she'd sent out on different trains. They all had to deal with this as well. She'd never really thought about what happened to them between the time she put them on a train and they reached their new husbands. Now she would understand what her brides went through better. She wondered if she would be more empathetic toward them as a result. Bernard made certain she was settled in her sleeping car. "If you need me, have the porter come get me." Elizabeth laughed. "I may have been a child when we first began working together, but I'm 26 years old now, Bernard. I can take care of myself." Bernard smiled, losing the serious look he always wore in Beckham, surprising Elizabeth more than a little. "You can?" He did his best not to let his gaze travel up and down her as he would have years ago with any woman who had declared her age to him. He bit his tongue to keep from telling her she'd become a beautiful woman. He'd watched her over the years, and his feelings had grown. At first, she'd just been a young woman who needed help with a business, and he'd left his life as a Pinkerton agent to be that helper. As the years had passed, and they'd worked together, he'd seen her blossom into a truly lovely lady, one he was proud to call both employer and friend. "Yes, I can." Elizabeth pulled herself up to her full height, her chin going up in the air. Bernard leaned against the wall in her room. He knew this trip was his last chance to approach her as an equal, and he decided then and there, he'd make the most of it. He'd thought about just letting her go, helping her find the man that she deserved, and backing off from there, but he realized he couldn't do it. She had to see what was in his heart first. She had the right to make the choice. He carefully let his eyes roam from her beautiful face and down her body, finally reaching her feet before they traveled back up again. "May I say that you've grown up beautifully, Miss Miller? A woman who looks like you could steal the heart of any man she met." He touched his index finger to her cheek, stroking it softly. "You're precious. Never forget that." He turned and left her alone in her sleeping chamber, heading back toward the main car. Elizabeth stared after him, blinking rapidly. What had just happened? Her hand went to her cheek, and she ran her fingers over the area Bernard had just touched. Did he have feelings for her? Was it possible he was as attracted to her as she was to him? Chapter 2. Bernard took his seat in the regular car of the train beside a man who carried a box with him. He was surely a peddler of some snake oil or another, and Bernard considered getting up and moving to another seat. Hopefully he wouldn't make too much of a nuisance of himself during their journey. Maybe the peddler would get off at the first stop, and Bernard wouldn't have to worry about him. He and Elizabeth would travel all the way to St. Louis before changing trains and heading south toward Texas. He wanted to be beside her every minute of their long journey, wanting to see her face as she watched the changing terrain. She was an accomplished businesswoman, and she'd never been outside Massachusetts. He wanted to show her the world. He briefly wondered, again, if he'd ruin her life by marrying her. She may not have been born with money, but she'd done very well for herself with the mail-order bride agency and subsequent newspaper Groom's Gazette. Men throughout the country placed ads in the paper, and women in the East chose men and corresponded with them. She had matchmakers in every part of the country working with her to make it happen and had for over 5 years. She'd come a long way in the years they'd worked together. When he'd first met her, she'd been an uncertain young woman who had been raised on a farm and had done her best to keep her younger siblings in line. Now, she was a beautiful, confident woman, and every time he looked at her, she took his breath away. He had no idea when his feelings for her had started, but he knew he was going to spend the rest of his days loving her, whether she returned the sentiment or not. He already planned to spend every available minute of their journey with her, knowing that she was unsure of herself when it came to this trip. Maybe it would give him the advantage he needed to capture her attention. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Elizabeth sank down on the narrow bed in her car, wishing she could understand what had just happened with Bernard. In the almost 10 years they'd worked together, seeing one another daily when he wasn't traveling and investigating some potential groom or another, she had never seen him act like he saw her as anything other than an employer. Was he finally seeing her as a woman? She sat for a moment, shaking her head, before feeling the train start to move. She'd never been on a train before, and she jumped up, running to her window to watch the train pull out of the station. She couldn't count the number of times she'd gone to the Beckham train station and to finally leave on a train, well, it was a dream come true. A few minutes later, the excitement of travel had left her, and she sank into the chair provided for her, looking over the letters she'd received recently from her matchmaking counterparts across the country. Even as many of them had worked together to stop the white slavery prevalent throughout their glorious nation, they had banded together to help one another investigate men needing wives. Bernard had been able to travel less and less. Truly, he hadn't needed to come on this journey. Investigating a man in Fort Worth was easy enough, with 3 different matchmakers close by. Pastor Clyde Williamson in Coltonville and Sally Jenkins in Dallas were both nearby, as was Stanley Littlejohn. They could easily investigate if necessary, but she liked the idea of meeting the man herself and seeing if he made a good potential groom. Yes, she wanted to see her sister badly, but traveling with Bernard and helping him investigate a potential groom were even more important to her. She lost herself in the work at hand and looked up startled when there was a knock at her door 2 hours later. "Come in," she called. Bernard slid her door open, a frown on his face. "You didn't even lock the door? Inquire who was there before just calling them in? What if I'd been here to rob you? Or worse? Worse? What could be worse than robbing me?" He'd already stolen her heart. He could have anything she had to give. Bernard shook his head at her. He knew she wasn't that naive. "I'm on my way to the dining car and wondered if you'd care to join me." She nodded, carefully placing all of her things on the small table beside her chair. "I'd love to." She stood and walked to him, taking the arm he offered, thankful for the steadying touch. The train never seemed to stay in motion for long, stopping frequently to let some passengers off and take on others. Train travel was certainly the most efficient way to travel around the country, but it wasn't nearly as exciting as she'd expected. The train lurched to a stop just as they stepped into the hallway, and she fell into him, grabbing his waist, clutching him under his suit coat, to keep her balance. In all their time together, she'd never seen Bernard without his suit coat, and she was surprised at his strength when she touched him. She blushed and apologized. "I'm so sorry." His free hand shot out and caught her around the waist, pulling her against him. "Are you all right?" He concentrated to calm his arousal at having her so close. Elizabeth swallowed hard, closer to him than she'd ever been. Her green eyes met his blue. "I think so." She felt his breath on her forehead. Wanting nothing more than to raise on tiptoes to kiss him, she took a step back, releasing her death grip on his waist. "We should go to the dining car." Bernard watched her get all flustered and smiled. It was as if she felt something for him as well. He hoped it was true. Taking her hand, he again placed it on the curve of his arm. "I wonder what they're serving for supper this evening." She took the change in subject without argument. Her heart was still beating too quickly from being thrown into him, but she couldn't complain. Being close to Bernard was her own little piece of heaven on earth. Why, she'd rather fall into him than anyone else on the train. In the whole world. When they reached the dining room, they sat at a table beside the windows. She looked around and realized every table was beside the windows because of the shape of the car. No matter, she still liked the window seat. Bernard smiled at her just before he picked up his menu. Elizabeth wanted to get things out in the open and ask him if he had feelings for her as well, but she just wasn't certain she could find the courage. What if he didn't feel anything for her? She would feel stupid. Once they'd requested their food, Elizabeth struggled to find something to talk to Bernard about that wasn't related to their business. "I know very little about you," she finally said. "What did you do before Higgins found you?" Higgins was the butler who had worked for her predecessor, Harriet Farmer, though she'd been Harriet long when she'd run the mail-order bride service. Bernard smiled. "I would have thought they'd tell you that. I was a Pinkerton agent. I went to work for Pinkerton when I was just 18. Elizabeth tilted her head to the side, eyeing him carefully. "And how old are you now?" It was amazing she could know someone for as long as she'd known him without knowing very basic things about him. He studied her for a moment, knowing he was at an advantage. He knew everything about her, but she knew nothing of him. It was one of the benefits of knowing how to find information about others. I'm 32. Elizabeth nodded. That wasn't so great a difference she would worry about it. What's your favorite color? She asked, a grin lighting her face. Green, he said, thinking of her eyes. She had the most beautiful eyes he'd ever seen, and he thought of them constantly. Really? I like purple. Lavender, actually. There's something calming about it for me. I know. There was little he didn't know about her. He had discovered everything he could over the years, needing to feel closer to her as he did. You do? Her eyes met his, and she felt herself drowning in their blue depths. His eyes were the exactly color she'd seen on paintings of the ocean. She knew if she ever saw a large body of water, the color would match his eyes. He nodded. I know a lot more about you than you think I do. She didn't question his statement. He always knew a lot more about everything than she thought he did. Instead, she resumed her endeavor to learn more about him. How many siblings do you have? He smiled slightly. Not nearly as many as you do, and none have been nicknamed the Demon Horde. I have 2 brothers and a sister. I'm the eldest. You seem like you'd be the oldest child. Who's next? After me is my brother Stephen, who is married with 4 children, farming our father's land now that Pa's too old to push a plow. My brother Joseph is next. He moved to the city and manages a factory. He's married with 2 children. And the youngest is Patricia. She lives about a mile from the farm we all grew up on, and she's married with 2 children and has another on the way. Do you ever see them? She asked. She knew he didn't take a lot of time off work, but he traveled so much that he could see them regularly and she wouldn't know. He shook his head. No. I haven't seen them in years. Is that your choice? Or because I keep you too busy? He laughed softly. He couldn't tell her the real reason. Mostly my choice. I don't travel as much as I used to, as you know, but I feel like I should stay close to Beckham. And you? How can I guarantee your safety if you're far away from me? Do you write to them? He nodded. Often. My father is a Swedish immigrant, and he doesn't read English, so my brother reads my letters to him. What about your mother? She died years ago. I was still young. I'm sorry. Elizabeth rested her hand over his on the table between them. I may not spend a lot of time with my mother or always agree with her, but I can't imagine her not being there. I know if I want to I can make the walk out to the farm at any time, and I'll be welcomed with open arms and invited to stay for a meal. Why, even the Demon Horde are old enough now that they don't bother me too much. Her lips quirked as she remembered her young siblings painting their cow lavender, but making sure the newspaper was on the floor under her, so they wouldn't mess up the barn floor. Bernard looked down at her hand over his, and turned his over, so he could lace his fingers through hers. He didn't need comforting, but if she was offering it, then he was going to take it. I've always loved that your younger siblings were called the Demon Horde. It has such a rich connotation to it. She shook her head. You wouldn't have loved growing up with them. I was frequently left in charge of them while my mother was at work and my father was in the fields. There was nothing they dismissed as too dangerous or too stupid to try. Seriously, if it popped into their heads, they were doing it. Like? Well, they were constantly into mischief. One of them would say, let's hitch up the horses and drive into town and buy all the apples we can. Then we'll sit in the trees that overlook the road and throw apple cores at people. They'll never guess where it's coming from. But people did guess, and then I'd get in trouble for letting them take the wagon to town and not keeping a better eye on them. We won't mention the fact that there were usually at least 2 in diapers to deal with, and I'd be cooking meals and keeping the house clean. It would have taken a woman with eyes in the back of her head to watch them all. She leaned forward as if to impart a secret. I think they all multiplied as soon as Mama left for the day. Bernard laughed at that, the sound filling up the dining car. He'd only really seen Elizabeth in work mode before, never just seen her be herself. He liked her this way. It sounds like they may have multiplied when your mother left. Too bad you couldn't have taken a photo to prove it. Elizabeth enjoyed seeing him laugh. She wasn't certain if she had ever really seen him so uninhibited before. I love your laugh. Bernard grinned at her, and before he could think better of it, he brought her hand to his lips and kissed it softly. He knew better. He should respect her as his employer and take care of her, but he couldn't seem to help himself. It was different now. They were no longer at the house, their place of business. Instead, they were on a train rushing toward Texas. He could think of nothing but pulling her into his arms and kissing her. Would it be so wrong? Would she slap his face? Or kiss him back? Elizabeth was surprised at the kiss, but she didn't complain or tell him to stop. She liked that the walls that kept them apart were no longer there. A change of scenery may have been just what they needed to grow closer. Oh, how she hoped that was the case, because if it wasn't, she'd become a mail-order bride. She was finished being alone. Their meals came then, and he dropped her hand guiltily. He kept expecting someone to jump out at them and yell at him for holding his employer's hand. It felt so right, even while it felt wrong. Chapter 3. Elizabeth couldn't stop sneaking looks at Bernard as he walked her back to her room that evening. She wanted to invite him in so they could continue talking, but without the servants she had milling about at home, would it be proper? Did she even care if it would be proper? She wanted to kiss him. He stopped at her door, opening it for her, his eyes drawn to her lips. How would she react if he kissed her? Would she slap him? Or would she return the affection? He wanted to know, but he was afraid to find out. Elizabeth turned her face up to him, seeing that he was staring at her lips. Surely he would kiss her. She could see he wanted to. Bernard rubbed his sweaty palms on the fabric of his slacks. Good night, Miss Miller. Elizabeth shook her head. Don't you mean, Elizabeth? You promised to use my given name. Bernard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Elizabeth. Forgive me. It's hard not to return to the old formalities. Especially when he was so nervous. Elizabeth decided if she waited for him to kiss her, she'd have to wait forever, so she took a step forward and slipped her hand around to the back of his neck, touching his soft blonde hair. She stood on tiptoe and pulled his head the rest of the distance down to hers, touching her lips to his. Bernard grasped her hips, pulling her closer as he parted his lips, his tongue moving out to trace hers. When she didn't immediately open for him, he leaned back, looking at the picture she made, her head still turned up to his, her mouth moist. He could feel her breath against his skin, and he wanted nothing more than to lift her and take her into her train car, laying her down for a slow leisurely kiss. He leaned down and brushed her lips against his once more, nibbling at her lower lip. Excuse me. Bernard lifted his head to see an older gentleman with laughter in his eyes, watching them. Oh, pardon me. Didn't mean to block the passage. I don't blame you. You have a lovely bride, and she's obviously made for kissing. You should take her into your room, though. This is no place for what you obviously have in mind. The man winked at Bernard before moving around them on his way. Elizabeth blushed, wishing she knew what to say to him. She was mortified to have been seen, but even worse that he assumed they were married. She stepped back into her room, catching Bernard's hand and pulling him in with her. Bernard closed the door behind him, his eyes never leaving Elizabeth's face. I'm sorry, he muttered softly. I didn't mean for things to get out of hand. Elizabeth blushed, embarrassed that she was discovered kissing him, but not ashamed of the act itself. "I'm not sorry we kissed. I'm sorry we were caught, but I've been wanting to kiss you for a long time." She knew it wasn't ladylike to just blurt out her feelings, but she didn't care. She was finished playing games. Bernard studied her face carefully. "Are you sure? I know we were both born farmers' children, but you've made something more of yourself. You don't have to settle for kissing me." She shook her head. "Don't be absurd. There's no man I'd rather be with." She sighed, knowing things were progressing too quickly between them. She should be acting shy, as if she couldn't believe she'd kissed him, but that wasn't how she did things, and she wasn't about to start now. "I'm going to let you think about things. I don't want to be seen coming and going from your room. Or kissing you in the passageway either." He cupped her face in his hands, kissing her softly one last time. "Dream of me," he whispered against her lips, before turning and leaving her room, closing the door behind him. Elizabeth sat down heavily on the chair in her room and stared off into space for a minute. How could she think of anything else? Bernard, the man she'd loved her entire adult life, had just kissed her. Nothing would ever be the same again. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Bernard sat in his seat, staring out the window throughout the night. Now that he'd kissed her, and they'd touched for the very first time, would he ever be able to go back to just being her butler and bodyguard? He didn't know. He wasn't certain if he even wanted to find out. All through the night, all he could think about was how soft her skin had been under his touch. How sweet her lips had tasted. How badly he wanted to make her his. He'd done fine over the years as he'd stayed at arm's length, but now he needed her to be his. Could he even make it through the rest of their trip without trying to get her into his bed? He chuckled when he realized the fallacy of his thinking. He had no bed. She did. He wanted to get into her bed. As the hours ticked by, he formulated a two-part plan. Her reaction would tell him what he needed to do. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Elizabeth spent the night tossing and turning, thinking about her sweet Bernard. She couldn't believe how good it had felt to finally touch him. To kiss him. She knew she was rushing things, but she wanted to marry him immediately. They didn't need to court for 3 years. They'd known one another for 10. She woke early and made certain to look her best. Her dress was rumpled, but she tried not to mind as she twisted her hair up into a knot atop her head. She knew the hairdo was much more becoming for nighttime, but she didn't care. Looking her best for the man she loved was all that really mattered. When the knock came at her door, she rushed over and opened it, hoping he'd kiss her good morning. When he just nodded his head and asked if she was ready for breakfast, just as he would have any other time, her heart sank a bit. She took the arm he offered and they walked toward the dining room. "I dreamed of you like you told me," she said, her voice a mere whisper. Surely that would get some kind of reaction from him. Bernard swallowed hard. He decided to act as if nothing had happened and see how long it took her to say something. Less than a minute. "You did?" "I did. I don't want to go back to the way things were. I want to keep moving forward." She stopped walking and looked up at him. "I've cared about you for a long time. I need things to keep moving forward." Bernard stared into her eyes. "You're certain?" This was the reaction he hadn't dared hope for. This is what he'd needed from her. Elizabeth nodded. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." "Then marry me. The train will stop in St. Louis at noon tomorrow, and we'll switch trains to go to Fort Worth. We need to spend one night in St. Louis. Marry me, and make our night in St. Louis our wedding night." He knew he was pushing her, but the passion he felt for her meant he either needed to not touch her at all, or marry her immediately. He was certain, now that he'd had a taste of her, he could never go back to their platonic relationship. Elizabeth looked at him, her heart in her chest. Do you mean it? He nodded. If we're going to marry, let's just do it. Tomorrow. I'd say now, but the train only has a couple of short stops before St. Louis, and there won't be time to find a preacher. She knew she should wait until she got to Fort Worth so her sister could be at her wedding. Or even back home so her whole family could attend. Elizabeth had never been one to choose the selfish route. She'd always thought of others first. But this time? She needed to think of herself and the man she loved. After a moment she nodded. Yes. Let's marry tomorrow in St. Louis. Bernard quickly looked both ways down the hall, before sweeping her into his arms and kissing her. It was a quick, platonic kiss, because he was afraid once he started really kissing her again, he wouldn't be able to stop. When he straightened, he tucked her hand back into the crook of his arm. Let's have breakfast then, my dear. The endearment made Elizabeth smile. She still felt like she knew very little about the man, but she could learn about him as she went surely. He was hers, and that was all that really mattered, wasn't it? Bernard felt a sense of pride as they stepped into the dining car together. They took a seat on the left side of the train. He faced backward, so she could look out the windows to where they were going. St. Louis is a big dirty city. We will have less than 24 hours there, but I'll do my best to find us a pastor immediately. Maybe we can spend a bit of time doing some sightseeing. Please tell me no, he thought. He didn't want to take her sightseeing. He wanted her to tell him she wanted to spend the whole day in bed with him. She nodded slowly, surprised he would want to spend their wedding day seeing the city. Maybe he wasn't as interested in her sexually as she was in him. She knew as an unmarried lady, she wasn't supposed to know about those things, but having been in the bride business for 10 years, she knew more than most. I'd like to see the city. I've never even been out of Massachusetts before. He did his best to stifle the grimace that wanted to cross his face. He would give her a day of seeing the city. You only went to a new place for the first time once. He'd make it special. The pollution in St. Louis is bad, and there are a lot of factories, but we could perhaps see a play or something. She shrugged. Anything we do, as long as we're together, will make me happy. He took her hand in his at that, squeezing her fingers tightly. He was always amazed at what a tiny woman she was. Her presence in a room was so much larger than her person. I can promise you that whatever we do, we'll do it together. Now he just had to get through the next 28 hours before she was his wife. Elizabeth smiled at his words, squeezing the fingers that were laced through hers. She wondered if he'd mind if she started questioning him again. She'd found out a few things about him the previous day, but she wanted to know more. How old were you when you left home? 16. It was stupid to leave so early, but I was determined to make my own way in the world. My mother had just died, and I couldn't see staying at home and being another mouth to feed. He didn't add that he had often fought with his father. They were both so headstrong. What did you do? At first, I drifted around looking for farm jobs. I'd help with the harvest, mend fences, milk cows, whatever anyone needed. I worked my way to New York City, and I worked in a factory there for a while. He eyed her carefully. You sure you want to hear this? She nodded. I want to know everything about you. One night on my way home from the factory, I realized someone was following me. I had just gotten my week's pay, so I was nervous. I ducked into an alley to hide, and they followed me in. The man had a knife. We had an altercation right there in the street, and I took the knife from him. It was a minute or two between when he followed me there and when it was over. Elizabeth blinked. Did you kill him? Bernard shook his head. No, but I was observed. A policeman came in and dragged the thug off to jail, but another man stayed behind watching me. He was a Pinkerton agent. Really? I've heard a lot of stories about Pinkerton agents. That must be how he'd started working with them. He laughed softly. Everyone has. Do you realize that right now, in the United States, there are more Pinkerton agents than soldiers in the U.S. Army? That's crazy. It is. Anyway, the agent asked me to join them. I followed him and never looked back. His name was Michael, and he was my partner for the next 4 years. He was killed in a shootout when we tried to stop a bank robbery. I was devastated. It was like losing a brother. He took a sip of his water, trying to calm his emotions. It still hurt to talk about Michael. I was approached by Higgins a few weeks later about taking his place. So that's why you're so good at finding details about men. She looked at him in a whole new light. Are you glad you stopped being an agent? He nodded. My heart wasn't in it any longer after my friend died. He thought of Michael's wife and the hard time she'd had following his friend's demise. He still sent part of his pay to help them out every week, but he didn't tell her that. He didn't want her to change her opinion of him because of what he did to help another. I'm sorry. I wish I could take the pain away from you. He shrugged. It was a long time ago. You've given me interesting work, and someone to focus my attention on. And you gave me time to heal. Thank you for that. Part of Elizabeth wished she'd known all along, but another part wished she still didn't know. She couldn't have helped him, and even now, there was nothing she could do. My sister is going to be surprised when I show up in Fort Worth with a husband instead of a butler. Bernard was relieved when she changed the subject. He had no desire to relive the sadness that he'd experienced after losing Michael. I'm sure she will. Will it be a good surprise or a bad surprise? Elizabeth shrugged. I think Susan will be happy for me. I've always wanted children. He blinked a few times at her mention of children. He hadn't really considered children, because he hadn't thought much further than their honeymoon. But children? It wasn't that he was opposed to them, of course. He just hadn't really thought about whether or not they were a priority in his life. He guessed they were. Kind of. Do you want children right away? He asked. Elizabeth shrugged. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. I'm 26. I'm ready to begin my family. He nodded. How many do you want? Well, not enough for our own demon horde, of course. 3 or 4 would be more than enough for me. Would you continue to work if you had children? He asked. He knew most women stayed home with their babies. She shrugged. I work from home anyway. Most likely I'd hire a nanny to help me out with them. The Groom's Gazette has been such a success that I won't worry about money for a long time to come. She blushed as she realized what she'd said. We won't worry about money for a long time to come. It was odd for her, thinking about having someone else whom she would share her money with. She'd grown used to being alone. He smiled at her correction. We could easily live off just what I make. I know we could, but we don't need to. And you'll move into the house, of course, she said, referring to her house on Rock Creek Road. He nodded, because he knew it was expected. Besides, he'd be crazy if he tried to move her into his small home, when she had a mansion at her disposal. Of course. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her palm. As long as I get to live there with you. He hated the idea of her being wealthier than him, but did it really matter? Just so they were together. Chapter 4. When Bernard walked Elizabeth back to her room, she looked up at him for a moment, desperately wanting to have more time with him. Do you want to come in? We can talk. He studied her face while fighting an internal battle. I don't know. I mean, I want to be with you, but I don't want anything to happen we might regret later. Elizabeth opened the door and took his hand, pulling her in behind him, and closing the door with a snap. I would regret nothing done with you. Don't you realize that yet? He shook his head. I won't dishonor you by making love before our wedding. Couldn't she see they shouldn't be alone together? She blushed. We don't have to make love, do we? Can't we just canoodle a little? I'm not sure how safe that is, he said cautiously. With as long as he'd wanted her, could he really stop when it was time? Was it even possible? She took a step toward him, meeting this time with him. I think I'll be less nervous about making love when the time comes if I'm more used to you now. Which was the truth, or most of it. She also really wanted to touch him. She wanted to be close. She put her hands against his chest. Will you kiss me? He frowned, knowing it wasn't smart. Of course, he had always been proud of his self-control. He could kiss her once or twice and be just fine. He was certain of it. Slowly he lowered his head, until his mouth was just an inch from hers, and he could feel her breath against his lips. Are you sure you want me to kiss you? Elizabeth stood on her tiptoes and pressed her mouth to his, her arms going around his neck. Bernard laughed softly at her response to his teasing. I guess you're sure then. He slowly backed up until he sat in the overstuffed chair at the side of the room, the chair she'd sat in to work. He pulled her down onto his lap, angling his mouth across hers to give him better access. She pressed closer against him, feeling the tension building in her stomach. One of her fingers traced his cheek as they kissed. She loved that she was now allowed to touch him. Why hadn't they done this sooner? He traced her lips with his tongue, but she didn't open her mouth, keeping her lips tightly locked together. Had she never even been kissed? Open your mouth for me, sweetheart. Elizabeth pulled back startled. Do people do that? He nodded, his eyes a much darker blue than usual, filled with passion. Yes, people do that. Let me teach you. He pulled her face back toward his with a hand at the back of her neck. When he kissed her again, Elizabeth parted her mouth, just a bit, and he moved his tongue inside to explore. Elizabeth let out a gasp of surprise. She'd never imagined anyone would do that to her, but it felt so good. Her heart beat faster and her breath came quicker. His hand moved down her side, skimming against the side of her breast and causing her to shiver. Did men touch women there? She'd thought she was knowledgeable about what would happen between them, but she could see that she truly knew nothing. You feel so good against me, he whispered softly, pulling her even closer. He was certain she must be able to feel his hardness pressing against her hip, but she didn't pull away. He wanted to push her dress off her shoulders and touch her bare skin. He wanted to taste her. Elizabeth pushed his suit jacket off his shoulders and ran her hands over his chest and shoulders. She had never seen him in just his shirt sleeves, even during the hottest months of summer. She kissed his shoulder through the thin fabric of his linen shirt before gently scraping her teeth against his neck. Bernard let out a low groan, realizing he was getting too worked up too quickly. He couldn't do this. Jumping to his feet, he knocked her to the floor without meaning to. He reached down a hand and helped her stand, his hands shaking. I'm sorry. Grabbing his jacket, he all but ran from the room. She stood shaking, her heart still beating too quickly and her breathing laborious. Was he angry with her? Taking the seat he'd just vacated, she buried her face in her hands. She only hoped he was still willing to marry her, even if her moral character wasn't what he wanted from a wife. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Bernard hurried back to his seat and stared out the window. How had he let things go so far? He'd been moments away from stripping her and climbing into bed with her. He'd known better than to even start anything, and he'd done it anyway. He'd left without knowing if he'd hurt her by pushing her to the floor. What was wrong with him? He'd only loved one woman in his life, and he'd tried to take advantage of her before pushing her on the floor the day before their wedding. He should be stood before a firing squad. Would she still marry him? He wouldn't blame her if she didn't. He didn't deserve her. Not even close. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Elizabeth was lying on her side on her bunk when the knock came at lunchtime. Her tears had long since dried up, but she was certain she looked a mess. "Come in," she called, hoping against hope it was Bernard, and he wasn't angry with her. The door opened, but Bernard didn't take the step that would bring him into the room. "Are you hungry?" he asked softly, his deep voice sounding raspy, as if he was as upset as she was. She got to her feet, walking over to where he stood. "I'm sorry." She was so ashamed she couldn't look above his tie. Bernard put an index finger under her chin, lifting her eyes to his. "What do you think you have to be sorry for?" "It was my doing." Elizabeth squeezed her eyes shut, a tear slipping out of her eye and traveling slowly down her cheek. He flicked it away with his thumb. "I didn't mean to drop you. It's my fault. I shouldn't have forced you to kiss me that way. I knew you didn't want to, and I insisted." He must think she was a woman of loose morals. How could any man want to marry someone like her? He laughed, the sound harsh. "Didn't want to? It's all I wanted to do. I just didn't want to shame you." "You could never shame me." She took a step forward, and his arms came around her automatically. Her head barely came to his shoulder, and she rested her cheek against his chest. "I'm very sorry. I should have listened to you. Will you forgive me?" He couldn't believe she was taking the blame. He'd dumped her on the floor. How could she blame herself for that? "You did nothing wrong. I just didn't have the self-control to keep going without stripping you bare and making you mine. I would have let you and never complained once." She kissed his chin. "Let's go to lunch. We'll wait until tomorrow when we won't have to stop." He grabbed her and pulled her against him, kissing her passionately. "I'm counting the minutes." A moment later, they were strolling through the hall, and her hand was on his arm as if nothing had happened between them, but she knew something had. She hoped he was being honest with her about his reasons for stopping earlier. She would hate to think that her feelings for him were stronger than his feelings for her. Once they were seated in the dining car, she folded her hands in her lap, trying to avoid touching him at all. She'd been too forward, and she needed to show him she knew how to be circumspect. Once they'd placed their order, she took a sip of her water. "We don't have to see the sights in St. Louis," she whispered, not meeting his eyes. She didn't want to seem too eager to make love, but she wanted him to know that she was ready when he was. He sighed. "We can see the city." "I know you want to." She shook her head. "No, I really just want to do what you want to do. If you want to spend the day in the hotel, teaching me to play poker, then I would stay in the hotel all day learning to play poker. If you want to spend the day wandering around the city, well, that's fine too." She peeked up at him through her eyelashes, keeping her head bowed just a bit. "If you want to make love all day, then we'll do that." Bernard swallowed hard. "Why don't we see how we feel after the wedding?" he asked. "I don't know how hard it will be to find a preacher and marry as soon as we step foot in St. Louis. We won't be there until a little after noon. By the time we find a preacher, it might be time to eat dinner and retire for the night." Oh, how he wished it would be late by the time they were married, so he could whisk her off to the hotel and not feel guilty about it. "What does it matter if it's night? Do people not make love during the day?" she asked. She had a hard time believing that, because they'd come awfully close that morning, but he knew more about these things than she did. Bernard smiled. "Of course they do. But for your first time, I don't feel like I should be rushing you straight from the altar to a bed." She finally met his eyes. "I wouldn't complain a bit. If it made her seem brazen to him, then so be it." He swallowed hard, trying to get his feelings under control. "I need you to know that I respect you and cherish you. And not just for the pleasure you'll bring me in bed. I know that. If I thought the carnal delights of marriage were all you were thinking about, I would never agree to marry you. Her eyes danced as they met his. However, are you certain that's not all I'm looking for from marriage with you? He laughed softly. I wouldn't complain if it was all you wanted. Men want women to feel that way, even though women don't want men to. Men do? Really? I thought men looked down at women who felt their passions strongly. Thought of them as loose women. Elizabeth was truly confused. Was it not wrong to want to have relations before marriage? He shook his head. No, feeling that way just means that you are a woman. I look forward to teaching you about passion. His eyes were the dark blue she'd come to associate with his arousal. It was odd that she was coming to know him so well before they even married. The waiter came to the table then, putting their plates in front of them. When he'd left, Elizabeth took another sip of her water. I look forward to being your willing pupil. Bernard sucked in a breath, wishing he could relax his morals for this woman. If he respected her less, he'd have had her in bed beneath him already, but he cared for her too much. He couldn't let that happen. Do you still want me to spend some time in Fort Worth investigating a potential groom for you? Elizabeth grinned. Yes, I would. He's not a potential groom for me any longer, of course, but we'll either find him a bride or include him in the Groom's Gazette. I'm so glad we decided to join forces with so many other matchmakers for our paper. It's been a godsend. I hated when you were traveling so much. He paused with his fork in midair, about to take a bite of his chicken. You did? She nodded. Of course, I did. My feelings for you haven't just developed overnight, you know. They haven't? No, he hadn't known that. He'd thought that being thrown together on this trip had caused her feelings to develop. They'd had the paper for 5 years. She couldn't have been harboring feelings for him all that time, could she? She shook her head, but said nothing more on the subject. If he hadn't noticed how she felt after years of longing, then she'd keep him in the dark a bit longer. There was no reason for him to have the upper hand in their marriage, just because she admitted to her overwhelming feelings too soon. Bernard eyed her, confused. My feelings for you didn't just start on the train either, he admitted softly. He captured her hand and brought it to his lips. I'm very much looking forward to our wedding night. Elizabeth blushed. I am too. I know I shouldn't be, but I am. I wouldn't have it any other way. Chapter 5. The first thought in Elizabeth's head the following morning was about her wedding day. And quickly her thoughts turned to her wedding night. She felt a warmth in her belly as she thought about what would happen between her and Bernard. She hoped he wouldn't insist on waiting until after dark to make love to her. As far as she was concerned, they should find the nearest bed as soon as their vows were spoken. A few hours later, when the train pulled into St. Louis, she picked up her carpet bag, which she'd spent some time repacking that morning. She wished she'd had time to shop for a special nightgown for her wedding night. Or more importantly, time to make one for herself. She could picture what she wanted, made of lace and the thinnest linen. Maybe she could make it for their first anniversary. He would be pleased no matter when she wore it, wouldn't he? When Bernard knocked on her door, she rushed to open it. He looked more handsome than she had ever seen him. His hair was neatly combed, and his eyes seemed to be lit from within. Are you ready? He asked. She nodded, looking around the room one last time to be certain she hadn't forgotten anything. She crooked her finger at him so he'd lean down, and whispered, The next time I stay in a room like this, I expect to share it with you. He leaned down a bit further, catching her earlobe between his teeth. You'll have no choice in the matter. He took her bag from her and led her from the train, his hand holding hers firmly. Why she felt it was more intimate to have their fingers woven together than for her to simply have her hand resting on his arm she wasn't certain, but she felt as if the new sign of affection was noticed by everyone around them. Elizabeth had never been in a big city before, not even Boston, which was only a 30-minute train ride from Beckham. She knew that St. Louis and Boston were roughly the same size, but she'd never been to Boston, so she was shocked at the buildings around her. She'd read that St. Louis was the third largest city in their fair nation, and looking around her at the bustling people, she didn't doubt it. Why, the Beckham train station could have fit many times over into Union Station. Bernard kept hold of her hand as he maneuvered through the crowd. He worried he'd lose her in the crush of people. When they finally made it through the crowd milling about Union Station, they went to the closest store. "I'm going to ask where we can find a preacher," Bernard told her. He knew she was probably getting hungry, but they had to marry before either of them lost their nerve. Elizabeth looked around the huge store and the piles of ready-made clothing. She spotted a nightgown like she'd been planning to make out of the corner of her eye. "I see something I'd like to buy. After you get your directions, wait outside for me. It's a surprise for you. I don't like the idea of leaving you alone." "You won't be. Just go outside onto the sidewalk and turn your back. I'll be fine." Her eyes begged him to listen to her, and he finally nodded. "It's against my better judgment, but I'll do it." She squeezed the hand he still held tightly. "Thank you." She stood at his side and listened to the directions he received to find the preacher, and then she watched as he went outside and turned his back. She rushed over to the display of nightgowns and found one that looked like she wanted. It was made of fine pink linen, and the collar and armholes were accented with lace. It was a beautiful garment. She looked at the front of the store and assessed the two people at the cash registers. One was a man about her father's age, and she had no desire to buy a nightgown from him. The other was a young lady who looked to be a few years her junior. She chose the young woman and rushed to pay for the garment, trying not to blush. She held it against her stomach as she walked across the store, hoping no one would notice what she was carrying. Why was she so bold about most things, but so embarrassed when it came to purchasing nightwear for her wedding night? When she reached the front, the girl behind the register nodded, as if she understood how Elizabeth felt about buying it. "I heard your man ask my pa where the preacher was. You getting married today?" Elizabeth nodded. "I am." She glanced over at Bernard's back. He was facing the street as if he was guarding her from anything that could possibly happen while she shopped. "I thought so. The gown is right pretty." Elizabeth paid her and waited while the younger girl wrapped the nightgown in a piece of brown paper. She tucked the package under her arm and rushed out to meet Bernard. "I'm ready." He glanced at her purchase, but refrained from asking about it. "You up for a walk?" He said it would take about 30 minutes to walk, or we can hire a driver and get there in the same amount of time, but sitting instead of walking. He shook his head. "Traffic is bad in this part of St. Louis." She laughed. "I've had enough sitting on the train. Let's walk." He took her hand, sliding his fingers through hers, and guided her in the direction of the preacher's house. Elizabeth was surprised to discover how nervous she was as they walked. She wanted to be married to him. She'd dreamed of it even. So why was her heart beating as if it wanted to leap out of her chest? They walked toward the preacher's house in silence. When they reached the front path that led up to the pastor's house, Bernard turned to her. "Are you certain you want to go through with this? It's not too late to back out." He said a silent prayer that she'd go through with their plans, but he couldn't live with himself if he forced her into something she didn't want. Elizabeth wanted to spend the rest of her life with him, but at that moment, she wanted nothing more than to run. No, she had to marry him. She wouldn't go back on her word. Not for anything. She suddenly wanted to beg for a few more days, so Susan could be there with her, but somehow she felt that the wedding needed to happen immediately. "I'm certain." Her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "You seem terribly nervous." "I don't want to force you into anything you don't want to do." His eyes looked into hers, and she felt like he could see right down into her soul. You would never force me to do anything. She sighed softly. I'm nervous, because I'm giving my life to you today. I'm changing my name for you. How could I not be nervous? He nodded. All right. Let's go get it done. They walked together up the front path leading to the door. There were flowers planted on either side of the door, brightening up the small white wooden house. When the door opened, it was to a middle-aged woman with dark hair and brown eyes. Here to get married, are ya? Bernard smiled. Yes, ma'am, we are. Is the preacher here by any chance? Course he is. I wouldn't come to the door if he wasn't. She held the door open wide. You live here or traveling through? She eyed them skeptically, as if wondering about where they'd come from. We're just traveling through. I was accompanying her on the trip, and we decided halfway through that we need to spend our lives together. As soon as the words left his lips, he realized how bad they sounded. He made it seem as if they were traveling together, and having intimate relations, without vows. Oh really? The preacher's wife raised an eyebrow. It's not how I made it seem, Bernard said, suddenly unable to speak correctly. He stumbled over his words. Elizabeth watched as he blushed, something she'd never seen. What my fiancé is trying to say is he came along with me on a journey as my bodyguard. He's worked for me for several years, and we've decided we want to make our relationship permanent. The woman looked back and forth between them for a moment before shrugging. Your names? I'm Elizabeth Miller, and this is Bernard Tandy. I'm Mrs. Johnson, she said, leaving the room. She came back a moment later with a man at her side. James, this is Bernard Tandy and Elizabeth Miller. They wish to be married. Pastor Johnson stepped further into the room, nodding. He looked between the two of them. My wife tells me you've been traveling together. It's none of my business, of course, but if you've been living in sin and want me to pray for you, just let me know. Elizabeth's eyes widened, but she refused to answer the question. Why would a man even ask that? Bernard shook his head. We've not been living in sin. Would you do us the honor of marrying us? He was seething that the man would ask such a thing, but with the way he'd bungled the explanation to Mrs. Johnson, he could see why they would think such a thing. Are you sure, son? If you have, I'm happy to pray over you before the ceremony. I've been traveling in the second-class car, and she's had a sleeping car. Nothing has happened between us that makes me feel the need to be prayed over. Bernard was annoyed the man hadn't dropped it. They could find another pastor if they needed to. I had to ask, the pastor said. Please join hands. The ceremony was simple and sweet. And short. Elizabeth was startled when he pronounced them man and wife. They couldn't already be married, could they? You may now kiss the bride. The pastor and his wife looked on as Bernard lowered his head and brushed his lips across hers. Elizabeth stared up at him. She wasn't Elizabeth Miller any longer. She was Elizabeth Tandy now. How odd to realize she didn't have the name she'd been known by for her entire life. Bernard shook hands with the pastor and paid him for the ceremony, thanking him. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to marry us, sir. Happy to do it. Bernard took Elizabeth's hand again, smiling down at her. Let's go find a hotel for the night. How long will you be in St. Louis? The pastor asked as they headed for the door. Just this one night, Bernard answered. We'll be leaving on a train early tomorrow morning for Fort Worth, Texas. We'll pray for safe travels then. Once they were out of the house and walking back toward the train station where they'd seen several hotels, Elizabeth looked at Bernard. Do you feel married? Bernard shook his head. No, I really don't. But I've never been married, so how would I know how it feels to be married? Elizabeth nodded. That's true. I just feel like something should be different. Something is different. What's that? She asked, a bit confused. When I start kissing you again, I'm not going to stop until you're naked and under me in a bed. He didn't look at her as he said the words, sensing her embarrassment. And I want to start kissing you soon. Elizabeth wanted that as well, but she was hungry too. We haven't eaten since breakfast. Would you be willing to stop and eat before the kissing starts? He grinned. I suppose we can stop for a minute or two. I hope you know how to eat fast. He slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her closer to him. I'm not sure how long I can wait. They'd talked about spending time seeing the sights, but he was no longer willing. He wanted to get her back to the hotel and start their wedding night. Just knowing that she was his brought his level of need up to the point that he didn't think he could bear even a 20-minute delay. They walked along in silence until he saw a small diner. Does that place look all right? He asked. She nodded. She was ready to eat anything. And strangely, she wanted to delay their wedding night. Yesterday, she'd been certain that once they said, I do, she'd want to jump into bed with him. Now that the time was here, she was too nervous to even think about it. Once they were seated and had ordered, she looked everywhere but at him. Her glass of water became mesmerizing. You're really nervous, he said, astonishment filling his voice. She nodded, not meeting his gaze. I wasn't nervous while we were kissing yesterday. If we'd made love then, I don't think I would have gotten nervous at all, because we were doing it because it was something we wanted to do. Today, it feels like we are required to make love, and for some reason, that just doesn't feel right to me. He took her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her fingers softly. And yesterday I felt like it was wrong, and I could wait as long as I needed to. Today, I feel like if we don't make love 20 minutes ago, I'm going to die. Elizabeth looked up at him for the first time since they'd sat down, amusement filling her eyes. What's wrong with us? Are we both crazy? He chuckled softly. No. You're nervous because you know that very soon, we'll be going to the hotel and making love for the first time. I'm anxious and needy, because your last name is now Tandy, and it makes me want you even more. I know it's right now. She sighed. I'll do my best to stop being a nervous girl. I'll do my best to take your mind off your nervousness as soon as we're alone together. He paused for a moment, knowing he should offer to postpone their wedding night by showing her around the city, but not wanting to. We could go for a walk in the park after we check into the hotel if you'd like. The city just built a huge new park, and we could find it. She bit her lip, considering it. She wanted to ask to go see the new park, but she caught his gaze, which was fastened on her lip where she was biting it. His eyes were dark, like they got every time they kissed. No, that wouldn't be at all fair to him. She finally shook her head. No. Let's go check into the hotel and stay in for the evening. She had to put his needs first now. Besides, it wasn't like it was something she didn't want to do. She was just nervous. Bernard let out a breath he hadn't even realized he'd been holding in. I'd like that. Their food arrived then, and Elizabeth tore her gaze away from her new husband. He'd always seemed professional to her, but now the only word she could think of to describe him was focused. He was so focused on her it was almost scary. As they finished the meal, she felt his eyes on her constantly. They ate in silence, but he was so intent on her, it felt as if she were naked before him. Was this the same man who had worked for her for 10 years? Who had never done anything improper in any way? Could it possibly be?